welcome to the Elseworlds Exchange. I am Sal, and I am joined today by Brad Guigar, webcomics guru extraordinaire and creator of his own amazing properties. He doesn't have camera right now, so I threw up a stock image. I picked the most flattering image I could find on Google image search, and hopefully you won't mind the image I chose.
Check it out and see if I approve.
Yeah, right? Well, there's nothing I can do about it now, so...
We can always start a fourth time.
Oh, yeah, why not, right? This is the well-oiled machine that is ComicPOP here, everybody.
That's right.
But, yeah, so, Brad, why don't you kick things off by explaining to the listeners at home and viewers here on the show what exactly it is that you do and how long you've been doing it for.
Oh, what do I do?
What do you do, man?
That's a question I ask myself every morning.
Of course.
What do I do?
Yeah, pretend you're in L.A., and that's the question that everybody asks. What do you do?
Well, I've been doing webcomics since 2000. I started in February 2000 on a GeoCities site.
Oh, no.
Doing a comic strip. I then went from there to Keen Space and Keen Spot and
Right.
all that ancient history stuff we can talk about. But my comic now is called Evil Incorporated. It's at evil-inc.com. And round about, oh gosh, what was it, 2005 or so, Scott Kurtz and Chris Straub got in touch with Dave Kellett and myself and asked us if we would like to co-write a book called How to Make Webcomics.
Yes.
And it turned into a really kind of a big thing for us. We set out to write the book that we wished we would have had when we started.
Right.
And I still get people bringing that book up to me at conventions saying how much they loved it. After a little while, I did the sequel to that book called The Webcomics Handbook, which has done very well.
Yep.
And I do a subscription site called webcomics.com that basically does the same sort of outreach, talks to creators, from new creators to seasoned veterans, sharing information on doing this independent comics thing on the web.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because webcomics have been around for almost 20 years.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
web-based comic books, comic strips, pretty much just the graphic medium available on digital is basically the definition of what a webcomic is, from what I understand. Mm-hmm. And they've been around for so long, and yet it took you guys a good long time for there to actually be some kind of authoritative discussion about like what they were and how they function, and not only how to make them like good, that's up to the artist, but the question is like how to make it into some kind of a business.
Yeah, well, that's because we were all making it up as we went along.
Yeah, and of course, you guys were just a handful of people who were making a living doing webcomics. That's the thing, is that like webcomics, I remember Bill Watterson was once asked about webcomics long after his retirement from the graphic medium. I think he was getting into water paint or watercolors or guitar playing. But they asked him, "What do you think of webcomics?" And he said, "I don't read them. I've never seen them. But I have to imagine that by and large they're all pretty terrible because you've democratized comic strips." Mm-hmm. And it's funny to me to be so dismissive of an entire medium, and it is. That's what it is. Webcomics have become its own kind of offshoot of graphic comic making.
Mm-hmm. I would be, although I've never met him, never talked to him.
Yeah.
I do know. For example, Dave Kellett has had a little bit of back and forth with him through the movie Stripped. And I would be willing to bet that Watterson's opinion of webcomics is very different today than it was back then.
And I have to imagine not only that's a good point, but also webcomics themselves go through kind of a metamorphosis every few years when I guess when different financial institutions either change or die out. Let's go through just a little bit about like how is it that you could actually make a comic, put it on the internet, and somehow make money when you started, when it was probably like, because I feel like, well, we'll get into that, but like when it first started versus today.
Well, it was real easy when it started. The business model, and I always put that in finger quotes because, like I said, we were really making this up as we went along.
Right.
But the business model that slowly developed was to build a community, and that's an important word. Build a community on the web, and then monetize that community through A, advertising, and B, merchandising.
Okay.
And it's that's really what it boils down to. Now, we always told our readers, and we always told people in interviews and stuff like this, it was a free comic.
Right.
And it never was a free comic. That was very good marketing, very good promotion, but it never was free. There was always a payment going on there, one way or another. The reader might not have been subscribing to that website, but the reader was generating advertising views, and those advertising views were generating significant advertising revenue for us. The numbers don't look great, but it was something that was cumulatively very powerful. And that's why in the very early days of the web, the most powerful, the most prominent webcomic was a humor comic strip.
Okay.
Why? Because that comic strip was relatively easy to produce on a daily basis, and the early web very much favored a large archive, a large accumulation of content. So go ahead.
I was going to say that kind of feeds into the current binge culture of our society.
Yeah.
I mean, like, the fact is, once you discover a webcomic, and I know I'm guilty of this myself, when I first got into like reading and absorbing webcomics, you eat through that archive like nobody's business, and you can get through like years worth of content in a very unproductive day's work. Behind a desk.
Yes, and generate a lot of ad revenue in so doing. But the way to get that archive big and get it big quickly was comic strips, right? And humor strips. I always say humor, particularly because what I always remind people even today is that somebody's coming to your site for the very first time today, and if you don't have something there to capture them, you're going to lose them.
Right.
People always say, the example I use a lot on webcomics.com is, what if I had a magic wand that was going to bring you 1 million new readers today?
Yeah.
And everybody, of course, would jump at that.
Of course.
And I say, here's the thing. You've already had 1 million readers. You've had 1 million readers over the past year or 2 years. The problem was you didn't keep them. Right? It's not about me bringing you and the honest truth is, unless the quality of your comic is very high, and at least you're playing this game at a high level. If I brought you 1 million readers today, you'd lose them by tomorrow.
Right. Yeah,
right?
And it's funny because I'm always attracted to the business industry and development of webcomics when I first got into comics myself, and it was a very easy transition to go from webcomics to YouTube because their business models are very similar. You give a large audience, you might even say like an overwhelmingly large amount of people, you just throw your content out into the world for free, and you say, hopefully what I've made catches you. And even the videos that, like, let's say the viral videos, when they're seen by like 1 million people, you get overnight success. You lose a huge percentage of that audience because maybe they've gone through your archive and they've seen, well, this is not indicative of the thing that I read, or this is not the kind of thing that I want to see. So it's funny how for me, even though because I had also developed some webcomics, as you know, because we've spoken on the subject numerous times before, it was easy for me to transition from there to here because I'm like, oh, I know how this works.
Yeah. It applies to a very broad swath of entertainment in general.
Yeah. So, okay, you start out with webcomics. The idea is hopefully you are multi-talented because in your case, you write and draw your own strips. But there are a lot of people out there who have done either just the writing or just the drawing and so forth. But for those webcomic creators who develop their own strip themselves. People like Scott Kurtz, you, Daniel Corsetto, who makes Girls with Slingshots. They developed the strip themselves. They put it out there on the internet. In the early days, you guys, I assume you guys were motivated by the syndicate model, because
absolutely,
because it wasn't about taking my work and showing it to people for free and owning and controlling my entire property. I thought it was the idea of well, you work through a website, right? You take your comic, you find some group that wants to host your comic, and then you put it out that way.
I will even do you one better. What brought me to the web was getting rejection letters from the syndicates, and the exact reason I started that first GeoCities site was not building my own business, but my fledgling idea was to prove to the syndicates that this comic could gather its own readership, with the end game, and this goes back to 2000, and it was a little bit, it was not as dopey today as it is back then, to aim for newspaper syndication. Newspapers hadn't taken the complete nosedive that they have.
Yeah.
But the idea in 2000 was to get a syndicate deal.
Yeah.
That's the whole reason I went to the web, was to build to show them readership statistics and to say that's why I should be in the newspaper. That's why I should be part of the syndicate. Of course, it only took a couple of years for me to see that very shortly it turned around, and I'm like, there's so much more potential here than there ever will be in a syndicate. I don't know that I quickly became, I don't think I would take a syndicate contract
really?
if they offered it to me.
So it was that much of a heel turn. The rewards, that is, made you think, no way. Is it?
You could see number one, you could see the writing on the wall for the newspaper industry.
I was going to say, yeah.
Number two, you could see the vast potential for self-publishing on the web, and in no uncertain terms, I could make since I had no middleman. And if I was willing to take on those business roles myself, marketing and accounting and so on and so forth, if I was willing to learn that and do a workmanlike job of it, then I could actually make a good living with a much smaller audience, because my dollar that I earn is not getting divided among 3 or 4 people. I'm keeping a big chunk of a smaller pile.
But you're doing multiple jobs as well. You're not just the creator who makes and writes the comic. You're also, like you said, the marketer. You're your own agent. You also, I guess, have to be a web designer in your own right. You have to be able to know how coding works, unless you're able to pay someone else to do that. But I'm sure when you first started,
all of that stuff we had to learn on our own. I learned way more about web design than I ever thought I would. I have a much better grasp on marketing than I ever thought I would, particularly social media marketing.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is all of those things were fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to do them. It was like, oh man, this is great. I can figure out how to do this and figure out how to do that. For me, it was never a drudgery. This was this thing that I was building that I was absolutely obsessed with.
Yeah.
And so every part of it was enjoyable.
And you think it's funny because most of the webcomics that I followed were created by kids, in a sense. And when I say kids, I mean people in their 20s who had either a business acumen or simply didn't want to do that aspect. I know, like, the famous story, of course, is Penny Arcade. Those guys, they didn't want to do the business. They obviously didn't understand how the business worked, and they, thankfully ran into a guy who knew how that how that worked and made it work for them in such a different way. I always love how different every webcomic and recognize has a different success story, and it's always kind of amazing to see just how different and how they managed to make it work, even in a medium that seemingly had a formula, and such a formula that you were able to, with your colleagues, construct a book that says this is if you follow this formula, or at least if you follow these guidelines, you'll have a better understanding and a better method of getting your work out there and creating a superior product. Nothing in your book, of course, suggests how to be, number one, creative and engaging.
Right.
But
right.
as long as you have those things, this is some of the guidelines.
We did talk about creativity, but we devoted a chapter to it.
Yeah.
But the one thing that Dave said in one of his early chapters is, listen, there are many paths to the top of the same mountain.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about certain things, and what made How to Make Webcomics good was that we would all chime in on each other's chapters, and sometimes we'd agree, sometimes we'd disagree in that same chapter with what the person was saying. So we tried to make it so that it wasn't like one single formula, but we were able to identify certain factors that seemed to go across the board, that we could say, okay, if you can do this, if you can engender a sense of community among your readers, that's a big step forward, because those people will buy books. Those people will show up at comic conventions to support you, things like that.
So the way that the business of webcomics worked is there a range you can pick from 2000 onward where it was, you make your content, you put it out for free, but you monetize through ads and I guess t-shirt sales and prints and maybe possibly books, although there is a little bit of overhead there.
The whole T-shirt thing, it always leaves a sting with some of us old-timers, because that was the members of the National Cartoonist Society in the early days did not want to accept us, and the reason they gave was that we weren't cartoonists, we were T-shirt salespeople.
Right. I remember hearing that.
So you say T-shirt with a certain inflection, and it always kind of gets my hackles up. But
sure.
All of that is no different. What that falls under is merchandising, right? Books, T-shirts, lunch boxes, action figures,
whatever.
That's everything that Charles Schultz did.
Oh, Jim Davis. I mean, these guys are the titans.
Jeremy Davis, absolutely. So we went. So to your question, we went along. I can't tell you exactly, but I can tell you when it hit for me. We went along like that for a long time. And for me, the tipping point happened in 2014. So a good 14 years of working this same business model, mainly of ad revenue. And of course, the further I went, the more I went, that archive built and built and built. And since I was doing 5 comics a week, that archive built into the thousands over the years. And of course, every one of those single comics is an entry point for someone to discover me doing an unrelated search on the web or what have you, and then it's part of a larger archive that engendered readers would start to go through once I kind of got them in under my spell, as you might say. That big archive was generating a lot of money. I used to run 3 different ad revenue networks on my sites. One of them could be counted on to pay my mortgage.
Okay. Wow, one of them?
One of them.
Okay.
And now, listen, that isn't to say that all 3 were equal.
Right.
They weren't. But one of them paid my mortgage, and I felt very proud of that. Then around 2014, I realized that something big had changed. That same ad network was not paying my electric bill.
Oh.
And the example I always give is, I saw this great, I think it was a poster or something. It's a great image. It's a clown with a noose around his neck. And the other end of the rope is tied to a sapling tree, and he's watering the tree with a big water can. That is 2014 to me.
Okay.
All right. Except I hadn't realized the tree had grown and my feet weren't touching the ground anymore. It had happened so slowly that I was like, oh my God, what happened here? And I was doing my taxes, looking over these numbers for the year, and I realized something big had happened. And when I researched it, what I realized was, as I'm sure you already figured out, ad blockers had reached the tipping point. Everyone and their mother had installed ad blockers on their phones and on their desktop computers, and it had completely changed how we were approaching our business. I realized at that moment I was going to have to make something else up, right? Ads were not going. It was. I knew enough about internet readership that putting a note out politely asking to be whitelisted was never going to work. It was never going to be efficient.
I've seen that request. I even see it today in 2017. People just saying, "Hey, the ad blockers are killing me. Can you turn them off?"
Yeah, never going to work.
That's like saying, "Hey, I know that everybody's using these jetpacks, but could you put on these roller skates because they're really messing up the whole."
Right. It's what happened is there was a real danger. Okay, so think of it. It's 2000. I'm one of the new young bucks.
Right.
Hard as that is to put in your mind. And syndicated cartoonists are looking at us and saying, "Hey, you're killing the comic. Yeah. You're killing what we're doing because you're giving it away for free." It was never free.
Nope.
But you're giving it away for free. You're killing things. And we'd be like, "Hey, old man, get with the time. This is how we do things now.
Yeah.
This is what this is what happens. This is what the business we're building, blah, blah, blah."
Yeah.
And you guys are dinosaurs, and if you don't change, you're going to die.
That's right.
Fast forward to 2015, 2014, and I realized that I was in danger of becoming that dinosaur.
Yeah.
I could stick to my guns and say, "Hey, this is the way I've done things for almost 15 years now.
Yeah.
This is the way we're going to do it. You're going to have to change, not me. You're going to have to whitelist me. I'm not going to have to change. You're going to have to change." And I reject that thinking, because I knew it was counterproductive. So I started looking at what could be done. And what I found very quickly was that the one thing that is working, and it's working better than it ever had worked before, was crowdfunding.
Right.
And that was Kickstarter and a very new player on the ground at that point, Patreon.
Yes.
And crowdfunding was working, not only working, but working way better than it ever did. And this is fascinating to me because if you're under 30, you don't realize that there was a time that people were not scared, terrified to do business on the web.
Oh yeah.
I remember asking people to buy a book or a T-shirt, and they'd write me emails. "You expect me to put my credit card number on a website?
Right.
No effing way there, smart guy. Keep peddling your tunes." It was not going to happen.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, in 2010, when I took webcomics.com to a subscription model, it had been a free website for a short time before that. When I took a subscription, it was a explosion of anger, including a death threat or two.
Really?
Okay. I can tell you some stories. It was bad. People were incensed about the idea of paying for content.
Right.
And then along came entities such as Apple, Amazon, the list goes on. The idea of making small payments for things.
Yeah.
How much has iTunes done for the business of comics just
True.
in making it cool to drop 99 cents on a MP3,
Yeah.
right? Amazon makes you feel so comfy. One-click shopping. You don't even they store your credit card. You don't give it two thoughts. You click that one-click shopping and get it delivered to your house overnight in some cases. Things are much different now than they were before, and it set up a perfect situation now for crowdfunding. And the beautiful thing is that this was all stuff that we actually tried back in the day. We knew about micropayments. We knew about this whole concept. Couldn't have done it back then. Now it's how we're making our living. It's how I'm putting food on the table.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for Patreon, holy cats, I don't even want to think about where I'd be. And Kickstarter, fantastic.
Interesting.
Fundraising. So we have turned from an I think Webcomics has turned from an ad-supported business model to a crowdfunding-supported business model. And those two best ways are Kickstarter and Patreon.
It's interesting because I can imagine that if you had said to yourselves, maybe 10 years ago, microtransactions. That's going to be, or crowdfunding. That's going to be the future. And you would have thought, no way. That flies in the face of our entire business model.
We sneered at it. Listen, there was a group, KeenSpot, a lot of people heard of. There was another, and by the way, do you notice the early part of the 2000s all tries to mimic the newspaper syndicate.
Yeah.
KeenSpot was was the same sort of deal as a newspaper syndicate. There was another called Modern Tales.
I don't remember that one.
Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember Modern Tales.
Joey Manley sadly passed away a few years ago. Joey Manley had this idea of setting up a website, and if you were a part of this website, I think it was 2 weeks of your most recent material was live. If anybody wanted to read the archives, they'd have to pay a subscription price. It did not work. It was not a huge success. Okay. I think a few of their creators had some success, but it was not scalable. It was not something that a lot of people could succeed from. And some of us kind of snickered about it. It was like, they're never going to get that off the ground.
Right.
Blah, blah. And it was a good idea. It was way before its time. Now I'm waiting for somebody to develop a WordPress plugin for Patreon. Because the minute that I have the ability, my archives are going to be a $1 a month Patreon reward. Okay. And it's going to be exactly the way, maybe not exactly, but very similar to this idea from the early 2000s that did not work.
Right.
People will think nothing of a $1 a month subscription. You don't even feel that leaving your account.
No, it's true. I make those kinds of choices all the time. I mean,
absolutely.
Especially if I know or am familiar with the work of the creator or artist, I have no problem. There's always a tier that appeals to me in some way where I'm like, I would feel like fine with that number.
Absolutely.
Now here's a question. You have this archive, you have this audience, you've grown an audience through an old model, and then you get to use this new these new means of income. But would these new means, Kickstarter and Patreon, would they have worked without the previous model and the growth that you enjoyed from that model?
I think they can work. But I would not want to try to start from the ground. Starting from the ground up is always difficult.
Yeah.
So it seems like you're comparing apples to oranges, because in both models it takes a long, long time to build.
Yeah.
Right. I'm very happy that I had put in the long amount of time that I had put in building an audience year after year after year. Because then I had that audience built up when it was time to switch over to a different business model. That doesn't mean that you couldn't start today and succeed, but it's going to take you, the same as it took me, years of struggling and building this thing brick by brick. That stuff doesn't change. There's a few people who capture lightning in a bottle and become overnight successes, but the vast majority of the overnight successes that you see are people that put in their time long ago.
Right.
And the one thing that grinds me is when people say, well, the one way to succeed at Webcomics is to have started in 1998.
I mean,
and that is there's an element of that seems to have accuracy, but what it forgets is every day between then and now that creator put his time in or put her time in working.
Right.
It completely disregards those years of work.
Yeah.
And by the way, here's the real bad thing about that. If you allow yourself to have that mindset, you've taken your eyes off the real target, you've lost your focus, and you're not doing the work that you need to do to be the person that they all are jealous of in 2025.
It's interesting.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You've taken your eye off the target.
Yeah.
The only way to succeed is to have been doing comics in 1998.
Right.
Well,
that's
maybe,
counterproductive. You can't.
And then work every day, work your ass off every day of your life between then and now. And if your attitude is that in 2017, you're not doing what it takes to be the guy that everybody's jealous of down the road.
That's true. I mean, yeah. Like, is there a grain of truth to the idea that, like, when webcomics were new and there was a smaller pool, that the cream would have risen to the top that much faster? I mean...
No, I reject that outright. And I'll tell you why. Okay. How old are you, Sal?
I am in my 30s.
Okay. Listen, you're wet behind your ears yet compared to me.
This is,
here's
not
the
by
deal.
Much.
I'm pushing 50 over here, kid.
All right.
Here's the deal. Man, you didn't have to agree that quickly. Man, you could have still harbored a little something there.
Right.
No, here's the deal. So I hear this one all the time too. Well, it was a smaller pool back then. There's way more signal to noise.
That's how it's felt for me.
Number one,
yeah.
There's always been more noise than signal. That is always the case. But here's what you don't understand. Before what? I got to go back and look. 2012, 2013?
Yeah.
No. Anyway, I'll go back and look. Somebody will look this up for me and keep me honest. When I started, there was no such thing as Twitter. There was no such thing as Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, none of these. You know what we called marketing back in the day? A web ring.
Yes.
Sal, you don't even know what a web ring is.
I remember web rings. I just never really... You know what's funny? I never bought into web rings. I thought they were... Like, I didn't like them. I didn't like the idea.
They were horrible, but it's all we had. All right? Trying to get the word out, as it were, trying to get somebody to find your work pre-social media was a bear. It's one of the reasons that Keen Spot and Modern Tales and all those groups were valuable, because that was one way that once somebody figured out what a webcomic was, being part of that large group meant that someone else's success could open the door to your success. So rising tide raised all the boats, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So back then, we didn't have any of the marketing stuff that we all enjoy today.
Yeah.
And social media, it not only is powerful, social media is the internet.
Yeah.
Going back to the beginning, 1998, everybody got those little discs in the mail. They set up AOL. They launched AOL on their phone modem, and they thought they were on the internet, right?
Yeah.
And for several years, AOL was the internet. And then people slowly started to break out and realize that there was a whole vast universe beyond AOL.
Yeah.
And that was the real explosion of the web. And that happened around 2000 or so, 2000, 2001.
Yeah.
And then the web became this vast universe. You could go anywhere. You could do anything. If you had a thing that you were interested in, by God, somebody already was setting up a website devoted to it.
This is true.
Now, if you talk to my college students, right, at Hushin School of Art, if you talk to a lot of people like my son's ages, the internet is Facebook. We've come full circle.
Yeah, it's like one-stop shopping, like it used to be.
Yeah. and this is a lot larger conversation, but our consuming habits have changed a lot as readers. Back in the day, readers were hunter-gatherers. They were out there hunting for things, and when they found them, they used things like bookmarks and RSS to gather that content so that they could come back and get it later. We are not hunter-gatherers on the internet anymore. We stand by a stream and let this wave after wave of content wash past us, and we take a little sample of this, we take a little sample of that. Reading habits are completely different now.
Oh, it's true.
Well, you can get into that wave and surf those waves a little bit and use social media responsibly and wisely. You've got all kinds of advantages that we didn't have back then.
It's interesting, though, because the reading habits haven't really changed that much, in as much as people still binge everything that they still absorb your entire archive. Like, they still want everything right now. They still want years worth of content.
Part is true. The binge part certainly is true. But remember, a binge it happens like when they first meet you, right? They binge. But then in the beginning, if you wanted to keep that reader, you had to keep posting something every day. You had to get them into the habit. The best email I could get was somebody saying, "Oh, Brad, you're a part of my coffee and breakfast routine in the morning."
Yeah.
Reading Evil Inc. or reading Greystone Inn. I can't even think of my mornings without those. Were the best kinds of emails to get because I had that reader in a pattern. And a pattern is hard to break once it starts. This good habits and bad habits work out that way. Today, I don't think it's as important as it was back then to have a daily update schedule. By the way, I just posted something on this on webcomics.com just recently. Mm-hmm. There's a whole generation of web cartoonists who are doing a strip because they've seen they equate strips with webcomics because, like I said at the beginning of the show, all these popular web cartoonists were strip people. That is not the case anymore. And if your story is not well told in a strip, you're killing yourself by doing a strip, right? If you can't make that strip a standalone piece that captures somebody on their first trip to your site with no backstory, then it shouldn't be a strip. You should be doing a graphic novel. And social media is so forgiving of the not daily update schedule that when you do put out that next big chunk of work, they're going to binge you again. There's no need to be daily like there was. There's strips. Half the people right now in webcomics doing strips should not be doing a strip.
I agree with that. I mean, it's funny how much translation there is between the two mediums. I know that, like, when it comes to YouTube and it comes to producing videos, they say, like, we do 5 shows a week, like Monday through Friday, and we might need to do 3 a week because because there are so many there's so much competition, there's so much stuff piling up in people's subscription feed that they just don't have enough hours in the day. And if there's like a big backlog of stuff, they're just gonna ignore it and move on and maybe leave you entirely.
Right.
So I could see like how limiting the content release is beneficial. And it's interesting you should say that, like, if you have a strip that shouldn't be a strip, it should be a graphic novel, screw it, just go straight to Kickstarter and just make a book.
Right. Or do a website, like a webcomic website, but instead of it being towards getting you to go into the archive, maybe you're posting a page or a chapter, and you are encouraging the person to download or buy an ebook.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But this whole idea of I don't like the page a day format so much. There's a lot that leaves to be desired, and I think you could kind of do like a whale submerging and coming up for air. Right. And when you submerge, you're working on maybe a chapter of your book, and then you come up for air and you splash all across social media. Here's the next chapter. Check it out. Bop, 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 and then you submerge again. Instead of that daily skipping across the top of the pond.
So, webcomics themselves, they had a format. The new technology or the new revenue streams that cropped up over the last 3 years have fundamentally altered the way through which webcomic creators can pay their mortgage. Mm-hmm. Have you encountered people or creators who have rejected that notion or are resistant to change? And is there any hope for them? Because it's interesting. You talk about, like, the dinosaurs and how it's like, this is how we've always done it, and it's like, well, you got to change or it's not going to work.
I honestly, myself, I haven't.
That's good.
most of the people that so there's two categories of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people who know you and trust you enough to tell you the truth, and the people who are kind of have to put their guard up and maybe are faking it till they make it and stuff like that. So I get two types of answers when I talk business with people.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people that I know that I'm familiar with and who trust me to talk to me about real numbers, they're seeing this same thing I'm seeing. They're switching over to crowdfunding. They know there's no real future. Except I will say this: one guy, Scott Kurtz from PvP,
Mm-hmm.
I shared a hotel room with his business manager at Emerald City. They're still doing ads. They're still doing very well on ads.
Really?
He's got a huge
audience,
readership,
yeah.
so it scales for him, and he's got some very, very good. I've got kind of one tier of an advertising network.
Mm-hmm.
He's got some advertising networks that are still doing really good stuff, and,
okay.
and he's playing this game at a higher level than I am.
Gotcha.
But he's still doing ads. But you notice. One of his basic Patreon rewards, and he's running a Patreon for PvP and for Table Titans.
Yeah.
And one of the base rewards is, I think, at $1 or $5. When you're signed into Patreon, all the ads on PvP disappear.
It's true. I've seen the same thing for Penny Arcade when they did it.
Yep. Absolutely.
And they went ad free. I think once they reached a certain level, they were like, okay, it's just once we have this number. Nobody has to worry about ads anymore.
And nobody does that because it's a frivolous thing or because it's a fad. They did that, or they can do that, because the numbers got low enough that they're like, you know what, we can replace these.
And turn it into a benefit. They can turn it into a reward.
Absolutely.
So if they don't, we've said actually the title of the show. We've said webcomics must change or die. They must. But it's not necessarily the format. It's more that the business model needs you need to change.
A little bit of both. Like I said, the format. I think I think I said half, maybe well over half of webcomics that are doing a comic strip. Those people need to change their format. Because they're doing webcomics as a strip because that's what they saw for years and years and years. They don't even realize that there's a whole nother universe of publishing. Going back to 2000, the thing that we heard as strip artists all the time was the web is unfair to long form. It's so hard to be a long form.
I've heard that, yeah.
On the web. Yeah. And by the way, they had an adequate point. Today's internet not only embraces long form, but in a lot of ways encourages long form work. So there's a lot of benefits to doing long form work. Again, going back to that binge mentality and stuff like that. The web is a lot more accepting of a long form artist. But if you're actually doing a long form cartoon, but you're trying to chop it into strips, you're killing yourself. Those guys that need to change their format, and also, I think all of us are accepting the very real situation of changing our business.
So we've talked about that. What do you foresee? Because you've been in this industry for some time, and I think it's fair to say that you're a pioneer of this industry. What's the future like for webcomics?
Oh, you know what? It's really hard to say because so much. We are really right now at a 180-degree spin from where I started out with.
That's the thing. This is so unpredictable. Here we are.
Well, and it's also not impossible for me to get my head around that having gone 180 degrees, we might end up going 360.
Yeah.
So I really don't spend a whole lot of time trying to see that far down the road.
Okay.
Because it's impossible. I can see what's happening, a couple, 2-3 years out. But I will say that I think we're going to move more and more to mobile devices. I think people who are doing work that translate well onto tablets and phones have a huge leg up on the rest of us. I don't know beyond that, though. I don't know that I'm smart enough to answer that question. I will say, for years, one thing that really knocked my socks off when I realized that I realized it.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. Was that for years, my website, evilinc.com, was my palace. Anything that I did drove traffic to that site because I was running ads there.
Yeah.
If somebody was scraping my site, you're familiar with a comic scraper, right? They use RSS to automatically pull the new content off your site and put it on theirs.
Yeah.
Scrapers got a cease and desist immediately from me. If anybody was putting my comic anywhere that wasn't my site, they were on the fighting side of Brad, right?
Yeah.
Today, I mirror my comic on Tapastic.
Right.
I mirror my comic on Lion Webtoons. I put my comic out in as many different places as I can because it's no longer about me driving traffic to my website. It's about me driving traffic to my Patreon.
Right. It's about eyeballs. You want to get as many people to be aware of Evil Inc. and want it, and then go to this one place where... And it's not like a website where... They go to the website and they like explore and discover and go through the archive. With the Patreon, it's just they go to the Patreon, boom. Like there's only two things you're doing at Patreon. You are either paying or you're receiving. Like
right.
So
and the secret to Patreon and I see a lot of people getting this wrong. There's a lot of people struggling with Patreon because they think it's a tip jar.
Yeah.
Here's a quick tip for you. Patreon's not a tip jar. Patreon's a subscription service.
Yeah.
The quicker you figure that out, the quicker you're going to succeed on Patreon. And what works on subscription services? Exclusive content.
Absolutely.
What we're going to... Okay, you want to hear the future?
Yeah.
I'll tell you what the future is, Sal. You get me all worked up.
All right, here we go.
I'll tell you what the future is. The future of webcomics and the internet in general is that we are going to go from an internet where everything was quote-unquote free and ad-supported to basically what's happening in entertainment tonight, or in entertainment right now. Sal, how many of these do you have? Netflix?
Yep.
Hulu?
I don't use Hulu, but only because I have a fundamental problem with it. Plus, I have cable and DVR.
Okay, so plus your cable.
Yep.
Plus, when Star Trek comes out, you're going to get CBS.
Right? I gotta get
you
CBS.
You bet your boots you are. And CISO and HBO, Game of Thrones, you're going to get HBO Now.
Yeah.
And Cinemax, because there might be something there you want.
I think Evil
and on
Dead.
and on and on and on. And you're paying individually for each one of those.
Yeah, but
that's what's going to happen on the web too. What's going to happen is you're going to be a Patreon backer of mine, and you're going to be a Patreon backer of Scott's, and slowly more and more content is going to go behind a paywall.
Right.
And you're going to actually be paying a lot more for those individual things that you get, and the quality of the free stuff is going to slowly slide down, and you're going to be paying micropayments for a lot of stuff down the road.
We've seen that in the video game industry. Just like for the most part, like AAA title publishers have learned that they can get a huge game out faster if they don't finish it, and if it's a little broken, if they can release anything that's like actually part of the content through microtransactions and updates that you can pay for. DLC is what they call it.
Yeah.
Now, that frustrates me as a person who likes one-stop shopping. We talked about how AOL and Facebook are the one places.
Yeah.
One of the appeals of Netflix when it first started to stream, was, holy shit, I can watch all my movies, and I can watch my shows, and I don't really need all these... I don't need, like, this menu of options, because I have this one source. I think you're absolutely right that we are seeing, in the future, we're going to see a diversification of all of our media. Mm-hmm. I don't think that is the end game, but I think it will definitely be, because I mean, what happened when Netflix finally became successful? Fox, all the TV companies were like, wait a minute. We could do this ourselves. We could take our entire catalog, put it behind a paywall, make it a subscription-based thing. So that kind of broke what Netflix became, and actually, and as a result, Netflix had to respond and change and become, kind of like an original programming developer.
And thank goodness they did. Look at all the great things they're doing.
That's true.
Here's the deal. Change is always a little bit scary.
Sure.
But I don't think it's necessarily going to be a bad thing. I think you're going to see that this actually brings out a lot of great stuff. And for creators, if you're a comic creator who can do a good comic, by the way, just one quick tangent.
Sure.
Who can do a good comic? That's everything that we discussed today means bupkis unless you can do a good comic.
There's
true. So many people out there who think that they can just put crap up there and that it's going to be accepted and you have to first be able to deliver quality and deliver it consistently before you can make money doing this. And if you're not making money or if you don't got the traffic you think you should have, it isn't because you haven't discovered the right hashtag just yet. It isn't because social media. It isn't because signal to noise. It isn't because the world's unfair. It's because you're not doing a quality comic. And you should be spending your time improving and not worried about social media and SEO and hashtags and all that other stuff. First, do a good comic.
Yeah.
But for those people who can do a good comic, so those people who can really deliver, the money is so much better under a subscription model than it was under ads. They'll never turn back.
You've been saying that since we met. Like I think in 2006 or 7. At the core of every endeavor, you have to make a quality product. It has to be good first, and then everything else will follow. Yeah,
it's the first thing is quality, and there's so many people who miss that, or kind of, there's what's that called, the Dunning-Kruger syndrome.
Oh
you've got to at least have a basic amount of intelligence in a certain thing to know how dumb you are. and if you completely lack that intelligence, you can actually fool yourself into believing that you're brilliant at that thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that going around.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of people who think they're doing a good comic who are doing a very Dunning-Kruger comic.
Yeah. I had one question from the audience that I thought was interesting, and it's not really related, so I thought I'd kind of cap it there.
So is it who do you think you are? I get that one a lot.
No, thankfully, a lot of people are enchanted by this experience. But my question is, are you familiar with the comic system of virtual reality with comics, like the AR view and stuff like that? And is there? I see it as a gimmick. Is that something that
I kind of do
has
too.
value?
Here's the deal. All of that stuff is great. All that stuff is fine. Virtual reality comics and multimedia comics and infinite scroll comics and yada yada yada. All that stuff is great. Here's what it comes down to: storytelling. It's all about the story.
Yeah.
And if that virtual reality format is how you tell your story, if that story is good, then you're going to do great.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you need to do a virtual reality comic? Nope. You can still do a 4-panel comic strip and do brilliant work if your story is good. If you're, in that case, perhaps if your humor is spot on. But I don't get too wrapped up in all of those things. I'm more interested in the story.
Yeah.
I want to tell good stories. That's what brings me to the game. All that other stuff is fine, and believe me, there's going to be. Instagram just released the ability to do multiple photo posts, right? And the first thing people started asking me, "Hey, that's like a comic strip. You can do a comic strip." I'm like, "Yeah, you could. You could. Here's the 3 problems that I have with that. Boom, boom, boom.
Right.
But if the story's good, if you did that and did a brilliant story or did something that engaged and captivated people, you're going to be a success.
Yeah.
Did you need Instagram's multi-photo? Nope. But if you used that and did a brilliant story, of course you would succeed.
Yeah. I think it's why Vine didn't work out. And I remember a lot of critics of the Vine video format, which of course is now dead. Somebody I never forgot it. They said something like, the fact is you can't, like the 6 seconds. You can't do anything compelling in 6 seconds.
Yeah, you really can't.
I mean, you could, a person can fall down in 6 seconds. You could tell a very quick joke in 6 seconds, but the fact of the matter is, there was no substantial content from that format.
There's a reason it fell under its own weight.
Yeah, I mean, besides the fact that like there was literally no way to monetize it.
Well, that's my problem with Instagram. It's like you can't put a live link in the post. You've got to go back to the bio page. Nobody's going to go back to the bio page unless you look very, very good on camera.
Oh yeah,
and Instagram is not set up to be, in my opinion, a good social media for the promoting cartoonist.
No, I agree.
But then again, there's people doing it, and a lot of times, sometimes it just, in the same way that it took a syndicate giving me a rejection letter to get me to go on to Webcomics, my saying that something is impossible is going to make somebody out there in your audience say, that guy's full of shit, and I'm going to show him why.
That's right.
And if that happens, thank goodness. There's nothing I love better is to be proven wrong in a situation like that. I love being wrong when it's something like that.
Well, there you go, man. That was that you hit it right on the head at an hour. I think that's a perfect way to cap the show.
Good.
But
you
listen,
can tell I'm like a trained seal. You can put me out there, I go for exactly 60 minutes and then peter out.
You completely you put a perfect button at the end of the show, man.
Yeah,
Nicely
good,
done.
Good.
Let me tell you, this has been a fascinating conversation. I think we've hit on a number of topics, but I think we could probably go for a while longer. I'm not going to do that, but I think what we should do, because what I do is we like to, what we'll do, like, this is actually the origin of our channel, was like, whoa, stop what you're doing, save it, we'll put that in another thing. So
well, listen, you know what I'm going to tell you. Anytime you want me, I love the sound of my own voice. Anytime you want me to come and do a podcast, all you got to do is say the word. One thing I do want to talk about sometime when we got a chance to delve into it is that the thing that has really turned my business around is not safe for work stuff that I've been doing on.
We didn't even get a chance to talk about that. Do you want to take a minute and do that?
It's a whole deeper conversation, but I will say this. I found out very quickly that that's what my readers were willing to pay for.
Yeah.
And that's what you got to do on Patreon, find out what your readers are willing to pay for. For me, it was not safe for work. For you, it's going to be something different. Everybody's going to have their different thing. But I can tell you, number one, I have so much respect for people who are doing that because, man, you got to really know your anatomy to draw that stuff.
Yeah.
I can also say that, so I thought it was going to be this one thing going in, and having done it for a year and a half now, there are so many great stories you can tell under that genre. There's so much compelling kind of plot that you can put out. It is, I gotta say, I have got a renewed respect for people who work in this type of comics because, man, I'm having the time of my life.
It's funny.
The biggest challenge I've ever had.
Yeah.
And writing wise and drawing wise, biggest challenge by far. And it's some of the most satisfying work I've ever done.
Yeah. And who'd have thought, right? Sex. How could that not be a font of money and experience?
Funny, it only took me 17 years to
figure it out. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to check that out, by the way, all the links are in the description box below this video, which is a thing that nobody clicks for some reason, which is why it's the top thing. It's right there. Check out Brad's Kickstarter and his Patreon, and see for yourself. Find out. Go on the journey. Because it's totally worth it. And Brad, we got to have you back on, man, because this has been an absolute pleasure. I think we should just do an episode. I think, what's funny? Sex sells. We'll call it like the NSFW show, and people will be like, holy shit.
Yeah, we'll drop a bunch of dirty words. I'll be
smoking
a cigar over here. We'll do it up right.
Yeah. Sounds good, man. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching and listening to this episode of the Elseworlds Exchange. Please make sure to check out everything that Brad Guigar does. Go to Guigar.com or check the description box below this video for all links associated with his projects. And we'll see you guys next week with another episode. Brad, thanks so much for being on the show, man.
Thank you, Sal. I had a blast.
And we'll see you guys next week. So long.